Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage.
Hey folks, I'm back. It's been a few days since I did a video. Probably would have done one yesterday, but I had to go to a wake. A really good friend of my sister and her husband's, a married couple. The woman passed away, the married couple, age 66, so she wasn't that old. Kind of sad. She's a sweet woman. And since my sister and her husband had been friends of theirs for over 40 years, I can't believe that. Seems like a lifetime right there. But the woman was 25 when she got married, which seems kind of young now. Maybe it was a little more common in the 1970s and the mid-70s when they got married. But still seems pretty young to me. I couldn't imagine, myself being married at 25. But they stayed married for over 40 years, 42 years or something like that. And sweet woman, unfortunately passed away. And I saw her, quite a bit over the years. She would be at my sister's house, and I would see her over there. Even before my sister got married, the couple would come over to my house, the house, my parents' house that both me and my sister were living in. So they were over there sometimes, back when we were much younger, and she was first married. I tend to avoid those things. I'm not religious at all, in any way, shape, or form, and I really don't appreciate the religious vibe of a lot of these. The wakes and the funerals and whatnot. I didn't go to the funeral. I really tried to avoid them as much as possible, to be honest. I really, I don't know that they do any good to make anybody feel any better, and the wake is something else entirely, when you've got an open casket and the deceased is laid out right in front of you and you sit there for hours. I was only at the wake for minutes. But she was such a sweet woman, and and I tend not to go to these things very often. I'll tell you, there's a few people at my old job that passed away. I did not go to their wakes or funerals. Like I said, I just for the most part, it's not really something I believe in. It's strange. It's it's a strange thing, and of course, it gets you thinking. I'm pretty capable of being really morbid on my own, for a lot of reasons. But you could tell that. I mean, it's been even just from the my interests point of view, and my main interest, of course, being music. We've seen all of these people pass away in recent years. And recently, I may have mentioned it in my video. I probably have several times. But when I really got into jazz around 1978, and as a result, all of those musicians that I got into from that point onward, I stayed fans of. When I was younger, prior to that, and in high school age and stuff like that, a lot of the rock musicians, I might read up on occasion to follow their career and what they're up to, and if they pass away or whatever. But it's not music that I listen to anymore. But from 1978 on, when I kind of started discovering jazz and, all that stuff, the modern classical and classical music and, bebop and electronic music and everything, all that stuff that I got into then, I'm still into now, and I follow. So when one of those people pass away, it's just as big a deal to me as some of the people that passed away that I've known in my personal life, actually. Big one was John Abercrombie, and like I did mention, I know one of the reasons why is because he lived so darn close to me, and I was always hoping that when I would go out somewhere, especially heading north, which is where he lived north of me, I'd always keep my eyes open for a couple jazz musicians that I knew that lived out that way, like Jack DeJohnette and John Abercrombie, and Carla Bley and Steve Swallow, people like that. But yeah, you know, even if you don't have somebody in your immediate life, you know, somebody that you personally knew in your orbit, that's passed away recently, which, you know, or has passed away even, you know, within the last couple of years, enough to it to be something that you can still very substantially feel. I think, you know, being music fans, and most of the folks that would watch this have been people that have been, you know, music fans for decades and decades, and are experiencing a lot of the same thing of having some people that they're into pass away. And, you know, so it's been a year now since John Abercrombie passed away, and I'm still, like, flabbergasted about that. It's still almost not a believable thing to me. And when I got into jazz, shit, in '78, you know, even Lionel Hampton was still around. You know, he was definitely one of the elder statesmen. And I took for granted some of these names of people that I had heard of, like Lionel Hampton, that I wouldn't have been into their music when I was in high school. But later on, in the late 70s, got into jazz and started appreciating them. It was amazing how these people at the time would pop up on TV on like a weekly basis. Now, at that time here in the U.S., we had, you know, PBS Public Broadcast System, which nowadays is playing a lot of 70s rock. You know, there's a lot of 1970s type Eric Clapton concerts and stuff like that on there. But in the late 70s, just as I was getting into jazz, this was a great time to, even though cable TV wasn't around with all the options of all the channels, and the internet wasn't around, PBS had several concert series that were on weekly. And even though I don't think there was any specific jazz programs, but a lot of the concert series featured jazz artists. And I would get to see the Lionel Hamptons and the people that, you know, I consciously was kind of aware of, and it was my first time seeing them. And I knew they were older, but at that time I didn't even think about them passing away because it was such a new world to me. So I got to see, you know, older people like the like a Lionel Hampton and that kind of, and even big band music, and people like maybe like a Woody Herman who was still around at that point, you know, that went all the way back to like the 1940s and 50s, and definitely like Buddy Rich, which would be a slightly younger generation, of course, but Buddy Rich was all over TV. I remember seeing the Great Guitars, which was three older established mainstream jazz guitarists, Barney Kessel, Herb Ellis, Charlie Bird on nylon string guitar. And one night, all those guys were new to me, and I discovered them all literally in one night, in 1 hour. And I watched them on TV, and it's like, oh, I got to get something by these guys. And I know I mentioned that when I saw them, instead of going out and getting a Great Guitars album, I bought 3 solo albums by each guy so I could hear them kind of on their own play. But that kind of stuff was happening weekly on TV back in the late 70s into the early 80s. And man, you know, Miles Davis was still alive. Thelonious Monk was still alive. And the two guys that I can recall, there was a time we have a jazz station based out of Newark, New Jersey, which is probably the worst city in New Jersey. Probably one of the worst cities in the entire United States in terms of crime and just ghettos and stuff like that. But for whatever reason, a jazz radio station chose to base itself there, which for many years prior to me moving here was great for me because the transmission was really great in my old home. I can still pick it up okay here, but not great. And it reached into New York City, so it was very much considered a New York City area radio station. And once I discovered that, it was actually the 88.3, which made it the very first FM station on the dial all the way to the left, and commercial free, which was great. And that came online I don't know, late 70s, early 80s, just as I was discovering jazz. And it still goes to this day. WBGO is the name of it, which it's on the internet, I'm sure. And I can remember driving around, and for years, WBGO was the station I just left my radio on. Even though there's, on the lower end of the dial there's all the commercial-free and university and college radio stations. And just about all of them at some point had jazz programs or like avant-garde music programs and classical programs. So I would switch around, looking for those, but WBGO was the one at that time was strictly 24 hours of jazz. They kind of broaden their base and they do blues music and like Latin jazz and stuff like that I'm not heavily into. I'm really not heavily into the real rural blues stuff, but for a lot of years it was just strictly like 24 hours of jazz. I think they did NPR News at one point, which I don't think they do anymore. But it was mostly jazz, almost like, probably 22 hours a day or something like that. I can remember driving around and hearing, and at that point, I was a few years into my jazz thing and I knew a lot of artists. I can remember hearing when Thelonious Monk died. I can remember driving when I heard that Miles Davis had died off of that radio station. Didn't hear of it off of TV, and I don't know if it was reported on in the newspapers. I want to say they probably did mention on the television news of Miles Davis passing. I'd be surprised if they didn't, but I didn't see it. Thelonious Monk probably didn't stand much of a chance of getting TV coverage in the mainstream news television, I mean. But when I got into jazz, there was very few people that were deceased. Even though I wasn't strictly buying new stuff. Obviously if you're buying new releases, the artist is alive for the most part, generally, unless they passed away very recently. But when I started buying like the Miles Davis Quintet, at that point, several of the band members were still alive. John Coltrane had passed away, Paul Chambers had passed away, but guys like Red Garland were still alive, Philly Joe Jones, Jimmy Cobb, so a lot. Bill Evans. I remember Bill Evans was still alive. I can recall hearing a radio interview with him. I think it was taped, but it was a new at the time radio interview that maybe had been conducted a few days or a few weeks before. And I just looked through my list of all the music that say I've got on my computer, the stuff I regularly listen to, or flip through my CD collection. Or just look at the things that I've, been listening to for the last month or so. And I see all these guys, it's like, wow, 90% of these guys are deceased. It's really a freaky thing. And I guess it's part of getting older, but, I'm always still interested in discovering new artists, or artists that are maybe not new, but unknown to me. But most of those, I have to admit, I'll sample a lot of new artists, and they don't do much for me, or they've kind of got one foot, like when it comes to jazz, they kind of got one foot in the jazz camp, which is great, but they kind of have one foot in the more modern, like, rock thing, and I'm just not into that anymore. And so even if it's a kind of different combination than the stuff you've heard before, like fusion and stuff like that, it seems predictable to me to have these jazz artists kind of have like a glitchy thing going on in the electronics or something like that. And so I'll listen to some of these guys and I'll enjoy them on a certain level, but they don't get to be that like special artist to me. That's going to be somebody that, I want to buy all their albums and hear everything, and I could spend an entire day just listening to their music, or put it on an MP3 disc in my car and have 8 hours of their music that I drive around and listen to. I'm not discovering any new musicians like that. What I am discovering is old musicians that I like, that are like that. And unfortunately, these guys are all pretty much deceased. And, it just seems to me that a lot of these people back then, maybe it's because they were more isolated, and now every type of culture's pop music is easily available to hear for free on the internet. So it almost doesn't matter where you grew up. If you're a musician and you're getting into music, it almost doesn't matter where you live, because you can sample and listen to all of the world's popular music or not so popular music, or jazz or new age or electronic or whatever. And some guy that's living in a tiny little village, as long as they have electricity and the internet, they might not even have traditional phone lines. Maybe they just have cell towers. In some little Cambodian, Indonesian town or something like that, some guy picking up the guitar can literally come out sounding exactly the same as some American guy, growing up in a big city. And so, we're losing that individualism that comes out of the historical music of a culture. And it's kind of like where a lot of the ECM, I think, musicians from the 1970s, the guys that recorded for those labels, which came out of various parts, for the most part, in Europe. And so, even though what they were playing is kind of jazz, they love and appreciate certain American jazz artists, a lot of them specifically somebody like Bill Evans. But because of where they grew up, and Europe is, in terms of the way the radio was and everything else, very also much geared toward classical music. I think over there, back at that point that these people were growing and developing, and even probably later on in terms of being on the radio, even in the 70s and 80s, I don't know what European radio would be like now, but back then it was a lot more, I think, classical music also. So, which is why you would hear the ECM artists who do improvisation and do kind of jazz type things, and jazz structures or that kind of chordal interplay or compositional chordal type of thing. Also, don't necessarily swing like the Americans do, and they have a moodier, more atmospheric thing that I think comes from classical music. And that's on top of maybe if some of these guys may have also been influenced by various bits of world music that may have creeped in somehow into their listening. But I think now the problem is, the good and bad, is that all of this stuff is available for everybody to hear, but it almost doesn't matter anymore from where a musician comes from. So you hear some Japanese guy who is taking up guitar or piano or something like that, and he may, instead of, in the old days, having some semblance of the, say, traditional Japanese music or Japanese culture or the instrumentation, he may sound like a guy that just came out of New York City, literally, because he kind of chose not to pay any attention to the Japanese cultural tradition and kind of went for American musicians and had access to them. And in a way, that's a shame. You almost no longer can listen to a musician and pick out where their background was or kind of where they grew up, or, well, yeah, I hear a heavy European influence in their music, so that they're probably from someplace in Europe or the surrounding area. Seems like that's gone now, but and the way I look at it is it's kind of a bad thing. Of course, you get more discriminating also as you get older, and but the thing, like I said, is I just am not finding new musicians, and I mean new musicians, I mean people even in their 40s, their early 40s, guys that are coming out in their 20s or 30s or 40s, and I'm just not being struck by what they're coming up with as being something interesting and new to me, like when I heard those ECM musicians from the 1970s. Now, of course, in all these years, I've been subjected to a lot of music, so naturally a lot of things aren't going to sound new to me at this point. But I'm not really looking necessarily for things that sound completely new and different, but I'm looking for things that touch me the same way, and move me the same way, and seem to be inspired and maybe a slightly different slant on things that have come before, or things that I like. And I'm just not finding it. So I'm going back to musicians that I, in a lot of cases, I've only heard maybe as sidemen and not as leaders, and maybe, you know, picking up or listening to something that they did as a leader. And even though I'm not shocked at the music being different because it's something from generations ago or from, you know, decades ago, just in terms of me enjoying it, I'm finding that I'm enjoying it much more. And just recently, not that long ago, I after not having listened for a little while, except for maybe a bit online, I just pulled out a whole bunch of Bill Evans albums, and not even his early albums. His stuff from the 70s and early 80s. Up until, when did he die? He passed away, I think, in the early 80s. I remember when he died, but I don't remember the year now. I should have looked it up. But yeah, I was listening to a lot of that stuff and really seriously, heavily getting into it and really, really appreciating it. And I just don't find new people that are doing that for me anymore as much. And I try to follow, pay attention, say, to maybe guitarists, because that's the closest thing I have to a primary instrument. But to me, even though there's a big technical jump, there's a lot of guys that are technically extremely, incredibly proficient. That's not what I don't any longer, or haven't for many years, listen to somebody just because they're technically brilliant. That doesn't mean anything to me. I want to hear, which to me is why fusion music died. To listen to somebody rip up and down the scales is meaningless if the composition doesn't mean shit, and that's basically what happened in the 70s. I don't know. I'm just not finding something that really resonates. And I hear these guitarists, and I'm like, yeah, that's predictable. It's almost like it was created on paper. He's gonna have one foot in the improv camp and one foot in a little bit of the jazz camp, but he's got these kind of this effect and that effect on the guitar, and blah blah blah. And it doesn't strike me as anything new or different, just because they may be incorporating elements of new music, and usually that new music is pop music, and this stuff is not going to age well. It's going to sound incredibly dated, incredibly fast, and so I can remember when fusion music sounded new, and like listening to stuff from, say, 1975, 76. And wow, man, I put it on now, and even if I liked it, there's some incredibly dated music that sounds incredibly dated that I still very much love, even though it's got that stamp of, oh, this sounds like this is from the 60s. But it's funny because when I first started listening to fusion, it was also around 77, 78, and so I was buying things that were done in 75, 76, and I remember how it sounded impressive in terms of, wow, this is really modern, and they're doing a lot of modern stuff and kind of combining elements of that and jazz and newer music. And now I listen to it, and it sounds like something that came out of a tomb. It really sounds so incredibly dated that it's like, wow, was I really even alive at the time that this stuff was new and fresh sounding? And it's really weird because you're not always aware of that passage of time as much. And this goes really regardless of whether you like the music or not. It's funny how some music, and maybe it's just a particular recording, maybe it's not even a specific group, but maybe it's a direction of a specific recording done in a specific era, that just really sounds like wow, this sounds like this comes from ages ago. Of course, when you think about it, the mid-'70s was how many decades ago now? It was a long time ago, and it was a lifetime ago, essentially, I guess. But to me, it sounds even older than that, some of these things that I hear. And then it's always amazing, and I go back right to like things like ECM, some of the ECM classic things, like the Red Lanta album by Art Landy and Jan Garbarek, which was recorded, I think, doing this off the top of my head, I think that was recorded in 1973, if I'm not mistaken. Pretty sure it's 73. I listen to that now, and to me, that could be an album that came out last week and that was recorded 2 weeks ago. Partially, maybe that's because it's entirely acoustic, and acoustic music tends to age better, I think. The problem with a lot of electric music is certain electric and electronic sounds come in fashion and then go out of fashion very quickly. Which doesn't mean that the music isn't good, but it kind of timestamps. It's funny how some of those things, I'm thinking of the Red Lanta album and a lot of albums from the 70s that are
on ECM, but also other jazz oriented albums that have aged well. So what's the point of all this? I don't have a point. I just came on here to gab today. And that's what I'm doing. And again, I'm not sure if this video is going to come out, because every time recently that I turn this damn computer on, the security software that I have starts doing tasks in the background. And that eats up a lot of the memory. And that makes my picture freeze while I'm talking. And I don't know what is or isn't going to come out. So, I was considering gabbing on a bit and pulling some vinyl, but it's almost a half hour. So let me go. I'll come back. It's incredibly the heat is not as bad as it was, though. It's creeping up. It creeps up to maybe 90 during the day. It was hot today. Today was also my laundry day, so I wasn't home for a good chunk of the day, and I was outside and getting sweaty. And went outside to go drive and do my laundry. So it's very muggy in here in the garage, not having any air conditioning. It's not oppressively hot, but it's incredibly thick and muggy with the humidity. So I'm going to call this a wrap, and hope that it comes out, and hope that I didn't waste your time, everyone. And so I hope you're doing well, and I'm going to be back. Hopefully talking about music sooner than later. Take care, everybody.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.